Hey guys, Matthew here, and today we're going to be going over the third portion of the Manifesto, which is auras, curses, and elemental damage over time. Now, there are some pretty massive changes in this, and a lot of them are going to affect party play, which is probably not most of you people watching this video, but there is also some things that are to be said about people playing as solo players, and some good things. So let's get right into it. Again, I'm not going to be reading through this whole thing. I don't see the point of doing that. There's going to be a link in the description of the video if you are interested in seeing all the values and everything that's been written. I'm going to give you guys, as always, a TLDR of what's going on and essentially the effects of some of these changes. So let's start off with auras and reservation effects. So they're basically changing what we know as, reduced mana reserved, and they are introducing this mechanic called reservation efficiency. And reservation efficiency is basically going to act the same way, except it's going to be not a linear progression. It's going to have like diminishing returns. So the idea is that people who invest very little into reservation efficiency are going to be able to get an extra aura out of it, but the people who invest a lot into it are not going to be able to get every aura in the game the same way that Aurastacking works, because aura bots work right now, because of the linear 1% reduced mana reserve which we currently have in the game. Right now, it's just linear, right? Every 1% is 1% is 1%. So you can get to the point where your auras are so very cheap that you can get every single aura in the game for a fairly minimal investment, to be completely fair. Right? Well, this is changing. Now, with their reservation efficiency and diminishing returns on it, most characters in the game, most people who play solo characters who have their, one character which is currently running either one or two auras, are going to be able to run an extra aura for free, which is a big buff to either survivability or damage. Remember what I said in the video yesterday, if you've watched it, I was saying that you might have to give up an aura to run something like Grace or Determination to get, the defenses back on your character. Well, that changes things, because if they're allowing us to run an extra 50% reservation aura, we'll be able to run that extra defensive aura without having to sacrifice an offensive aura. Or, if you're like me and all you care about is damage, you'll just run an extra 50% damage aura. So instead of running, say, just Hatred on my build, I'll run Hatred and, Zealotry. Something like that. So overall, this is a buff to most characters in the game, because with very little investment into the reservation efficiency, we'll be able to run a second aura. That's awesome. A second 50% aura, right? So when it comes to 15% or 35% auras or whatever, it's going to be even easier. All right, that being said, the downside is that for aura bots and aura stackers, tough luck. It's going to be a lot harder, and you'll actually need to make choices on which auras do you want to run. Do you want your party to have more defensive auras? Do you want your party to have more offensive auras? Or if you're an aura stacker, do you want to focus on defense or offense more? And you'll have to try to find that, middle ground. That being said, I'll go ahead and say it right now. Aura stacking is dead in the water. With this change, unless it's possible to get, back to nearly as many auras as you had before, it's pretty much completely dead in the water. So that's unfortunate for aura stacking. And for aura bots party play, they are getting a pretty massive nerf, where they're going to have to make choices on which auras they really want to run. Now, there are some auras that do very little, things like anger, for example. So it's going to be pretty easy for people who play those sort of builds to just throw those auras that barely did anything just outside the build, and just keep using the ones that are very, very, very strong. But overall, it does mean a nerf to party play. That's pretty much the TLDR on auras and reservation skills. That's pretty much what's happening there. Overall, nerf to party play, buff to single, or buff to solo play. Curses. This is another big nerf to party play. Curse bots are not really something that you play solo, right? Because, well, who's going to do damage if you're a curse bot? So for most individual players, this change does nothing. It's whatever. There is some changes, however, to cluster jewels. So even if, let's say your build used a lot of the cluster jewels, you're going to get less effect of your curses. Now mediums are going to be turned into smalls, so it's going to be small clusters for curses, which is definitely not very good at all, because on mediums you can get upwards of 5 notables, right, with curse effect on them. Now you'll only be able to get like 2 at most, so it's a pretty big deal. Not to mention that in the medium clusters you can put 2 smalls, but in the small you can't put anything. So there is some pretty massive nerfs coming to any sort of the curse clusters, but you'll still be able to get, you know, the notables that you want on other clusters. And if you can't, then you'll just have to go with a small one instead to get that one notable that you really care for if you can't get it anywhere else. Overall, though, I don't think that this nerf is too big of a deal for solo players, but again, a massive nerf to group play, because group play typically have a designated curse bot, which is going to be applying all the negative resistance curses like elemental weakness and stuff like that. But they'll also be applying all of the defensive curses like temp chains and enfeeble. Now you're not going to be able to have anywhere near the amount of curses that you could before. So again, a big nerf to party play. Not much of a change for solo play. Now, the big one is elemental damage over time. Again, we have some upsides and some downsides with these changes. The upside is that basically every single skill which is dot in the game has been drastically increased in their base damage. For example, Righteous Fire, which used to deal, deals 120% of your sacrifice energy shield. It used to deal 80%, now it deals 120 at level 1. It used to deal 99%, now it deals 160%, which is a pretty huge buff. If you look at things like, for example, Creeping Frost or Vortex, it's the same thing. Of course, Scorching Ray, also got a massive buff. I think that this league, because of the changes to the right-hand side of the tree, which is basically the dodge builds, and because of the changes to the left-hand side of the tree, which is the block builds, I think that the meta is really just going to be damage over time builds, which are ES-based. So I expect Lowlife, I expect Shavs to be very expensive, which means, flipping Shav's Divs card might be very, very good idea, something to keep in mind. But I expect a lot of builds to basically be going for damage over time builds and going for Lowlife, and that's going to be the meta, because Energy Shield got buffed by a decent amount through faster shot of Energy Shield recharge, and also through more Energy Shield recovery, and bases getting upwards of 10% more Energy Shield on base, right? So instead of your Val Regalia giving you 163 or 155 ES or whatever, it's now going to be giving you 165 or up to 165, which does get multiplied by all your further increases to Energy Shield once you craft it up. So Energy Shield got a massive buff, and damage over time, which works really, really well with low-life Energy Shield-based builds, just got a massive buff as well. The downside is that Elemental Equilibrium and Elemental Overload took a massive hit for this to happen. So let's talk about that real quick. Elemental Overload now gives more hits and ailments to skills if they've crit in the last 8 seconds. This means that you can't use a second rapidly hitting skill, making a small amount of critical chance investment much more important. What that means essentially is that you won't be able to, for example, put Orb of Storms on your build with Power Charge on crits and increased crit strikes, and just put your Orb of Storms down and proc Elemental Overload that way. You'll actually need to have your own skill, whatever you're using, crit in the last 8 seconds, which is kind of a weird change. Because if I read this right, passive skills now gives more hits and ailment damage to skills if they've crit in the last 8 seconds. That means that it gives only the damage to the skill itself, but some damage over time skills just cannot crit. So I'm not exactly sure what's going on here. But it's going to be interesting to see how people are going to be using that. But overall, this seems to be a significant nerf because it's going to be more annoying to properly use Elemental Overload. The other pretty substantial nerf is to Elemental Equilibrium, because now the passive gives you 25% exposure to elements that are not hit with, but it removes exposure to elements you hit with. So essentially what that means is that, let's just say that you had 15% exposure on your build from Frostbomb or something like that. whenever you use elemental equilibrium with, let's say, fire, you are going to gain 25% cold exposure because you're hitting with fire, but you're going to lose the 15% exposure because anyways, exposure only keeps the strongest one available, which would overlap your 15% from Frostbomb and instead give you 25%, which means that you need to sacrifice either a ring slot with Malachai's Artifice or some points on the tree or whatever to path down to elemental equilibrium in order to, for most builds, just get 10% more exposure, which is the equivalent of like basically 10% penetration, which on most builds that is only roughly 5 to 8% more damage, depending on how much penetration you're already getting on your build, which is just very, very little, right? Compared to what it was, where it would reduce resistances by 50%, that means that it got nerfed by basically 80%, right? We went from a 50% pen or 50% reduced to basically 10%. But of course, when you use this, now you won't have to use that Frost Bomb or whatever, which does open up a socket for potentially something else on your build. But overall, it is pretty weak. It's 80% weaker than it was, which means that Malachai's Artifice, which was one of my go-to ring, because it provided elemental equilibrium locally to the socketed gem, is now completely dead in the water for me. It's not something you'll be seeing me put onto any of my league starters anymore because it's just really, really weak, and you're better off going with something like Mark of the Shaper, for example, or just a regular ring with some curse on hit or something of the sort. That's kind of what's happening. So, I guess to recap really quickly, what's happening is overall, group play got a massive nerf from multiple angles. They are getting nerfed in terms of their aura bots and in terms of their curse bots. Single players got buffed because with very minimal investment, they're going to be able to run an extra aura, another 50% aura on their build, which is pretty good for either damage or defense. Curses are not really going to be changing too much other than cluster jewels for single players. And then elemental equilibrium and elemental overload got pretty much gutted, honestly. But to make up for that, the baseline stats and damage on most dot builds, or actually on any of the dot skills, got buffed by a large amount. So the idea is that GGG want people who are using elemental equilibrium and elemental overload to be used by people who are actually using dot builds and not people who are abusing those mechanics that are not using dot builds, such as, for example, miners using, or not even just miners, but any elemental builds using a Malachai's Artifice to get upwards of 40% more damage on their build, which is absolutely insane. So it makes sense that they nerfed it, but of course it does suck because once again, we are losing more damage. I'm not sure about the change to elemental overload. That one does seem weird, but elemental equilibrium change is pretty drastic. 80%, reduced effectiveness, if you will. That's pretty much the TLDR on what's happening with the third portion of the manifesto. Hopefully you guys enjoyed. Before I go, as always, I want to say a massive thank you to my supporters: Kat, Alex, Brandon, Nate, the second Alex, Flame Scorpion, Neroth, Grimoire, the Great Master, Johnny, Thomas Mass, Reese, Tim, Axel, Road to Millions, Atticus, Scott, Stan, Zarashi, Welcome Back, and Wolverine, as well as, of course, Ronald, Kevin, the third Alex, Bitizen, and Mercury, as well as anybody else who supported me in the past and anybody else who wishes to remain anonymous. Hopefully you guys enjoyed. I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.